Welcome to our viewers. We're in episode 7 of Tuesday Night Talks, and this is the pre-show chatter, as we like to call it. So it gives everyone an opportunity to check your audio, check your video, settle in for the next 43 to 46 minutes. I should be clear, though, that we're still very much in an environment where the pandemic and systematic social injustice are colliding. And I would say to create a very emotional time for everyone in many different ways. Here at the Audain Art Museum, we're reopening on Friday, June 26th. And as part of that effort, we'll dig into reviewing how the various elements within our operation can better address social equality. We should also mention that we have a couple jobs coming up here at the Audain Art Museum. We have a new registration and engagement administrator. So for those of you listening, it's a full-time position that starts within the next few weeks, and we'll have that out on our site. And similarly, we're going to have a few part-time jobs for a new Friday night effort that we'll be announcing soon, but we need some culture hosts, as they're called. And lastly, before we begin the broadcast, on Sunday, June 21st is both Father's Day and National Indigenous Peoples Day. And just a little advertisement for our shop. We have these wonderful halakton ties that would be suitable for a dad, brother, uncle, or cousin. So these are custom made, and they represent the flood work that we discussed in a previous work. So a wonderful piece by halakton. All right, so everybody's tuned in. We're getting ready to go here. Okay, so I should appear very large on a screen any moment now. Thank you, Justine. So welcome, everyone. We're starting the broadcast here, episode 7 of Tuesday Night Talks. And as mentioned in the pre-show, this broadcast is tempered by an ongoing cleave in Canadian and American society, as well as global communities around the world in addressing systematic racism and the social, economic, and political implications of that very serious topic. Tonight, we're back by the flashlights glow in the permanent collection galleries here at the Audain Art Museum in Whistler, British Columbia, and it's located on the shared territories of the Lillooet and Squamish nations. As mentioned in the pre-show, the museum opens on Friday, June 26th, and will be open through the summer on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. And stay tuned to your social media feeds, where myself and our Mayor, Jack Crompton, will be making a special broadcast in a couple of days to welcome everybody back to the Audain Art Museum and the Resort Municipality of Whistler. Tonight, we have over 303 registered viewers for this Zoom broadcast. Is that a new record, Justine? Maybe. Let's say it is. And the topic behind me is a wonderful painting that's come into our collection actually quite recently, and it's entitled Last Light. It's an oil on canvas triptych that comes courtesy of the Audain Foundation. And tonight, we're privileged to be with the creator of this wonderful work of art, live from his studio at Venables and Clark in Vancouver, Kim Dorland. Good evening, Kim.
Hello. This is
How
weird.
Are you this evening?
I'm good. This is my first Zoom presentation, so I'm excited to see how it goes.
As we all are.
Yeah.
So, and I'm going to hand off the broadcast to you now, Kim, to walk through the process of creating this brilliant work of art and some other related pieces as we move through the broadcast.
Okay, great. Great. Okay, well, let's throw the first slide up. So this was the first iteration of this painting, and it actually came from a very good friend of mine who's a poet named Andy McGuire, and I were sending things back and forth to each other. And he was sending me things that he thought would suit my work, and one of the words was skull set. And I ended up doing, you know, a handful of drawings based on that. And this was the first painting that came from that sort of game we were playing. And then I ended up getting a show at Equinox Gallery in 2019, and they offered me pretty much the whole gallery. And so I knew I wanted to do a really large version of this painting. Maybe move to the next slide. And so, so I started to work it out digitally. And I knew that my audience was mainly going to be, you know, to see the painting in person, was going to be in Vancouver. So I actually based it on looking across from the Spanish Banks over to Lighthouse Park. It's not literally that, because, you know, my view and the photos I took didn't have the trees in front or anything like that. But that's sort of where I placed this image. And then I worked it out digitally beforehand to get the composition and the color scheme, etc. Next slide. So a few other things were going on with me at this time. I was really getting into the work of an American painter named Anne Truitt. And if you don't know Anne Truitt, you should absolutely look her work up, because she's amazing. And she would do these sort of color field washes, these things like maybe 2 colors, 3 colors that would just sort of touch each other. And she was able to create mood and emotion and all kinds of things. And I've always secretly been a fan of the color field painters, you know, from the prairies and New York and so on. So that was one element of the painting that I was trying to get down first. And the other part was that I wanted the color to reflect the digital color that was on the iPad. So I figured that the best way to do that would be to have the linen not primed, but only sized. Therefore, I could just pour the colors from the top of the linen and have it kind of drain down. And as it built up, it sort of gained this very radiant, toxic color. Next slide. This is sort of in progress in my tiny studio here. The other thing that was going on with me at the time is I was teaching myself and learning as much as I could about woodcuts. I kind of decided on a whim to make woodcuts, probably because I was such a fan of Edvard Munch and, you know, always trying something new. But that radically shifted the way that I constructed paintings. And I think that, you know, as we move through to the newer works and so on, you'll see that more. Next slide. And then this is just a close-up of the skull. So what was oh, and then maybe next slide, and I can talk a bit just to give a sense of, oh, not this slide. Oh, the other thing that I do while I'm working is I'm often working on studies at the same time, you know, mostly so that I don't screw up a gigantic painting and have to start again. But also just, you know, as a way to help me work out the composition, work out how drains are going to interact with each other, etc. So this is, at the same time, I was working on a large work on paper. And then if we move to the next slide. Yeah, so another version. When I'm working on a major piece like this, I tend to work on several versions of the same painting at the same time. And then the next slide is the big one. So that gives you a sense of scale. And I was joking with Curtis earlier, I was grouchy the day that they were taking these photos. That's why I have such a grim look on my face. But this just gives you a sense of scale of the piece. And I titled the painting Last Light. About this time, I started to work on more narrative landscape paintings. And by that I mean, I created a narrative And the narrative is, just really briefly, is a plein air painter goes into the woods, gets lost, goes insane, and gets eaten alive by the woods. And these paintings, it was interesting for me to do it that way, because then I could play with the idea of anxiety and anxiety over the state of our environment. But in this way, number one, the paintings weren't overtly political, meaning, you're interacting with the painting first, and then hopefully, the politics of the environment and its fragility, etc., could come, in the back door. And also, it was a way for me to sort of play with the idea of my own psychology, or the psychology of the viewer, and how, the anxiety of the landscape and the anxiety of the person can kind of come together to create a painting that is hopefully more impactful, if that makes any kind of sense. At least that's what I did to make it work. If we go to, no, please interrupt me, please.
And I will. You had mentioned earlier today that, and earlier here, that you had experimented a little bit with woodcuts, and I know that you have a version of a woodcut that was at Equinox, and perhaps you could show us that and talk about it a little bit in terms of how it shifted your practice.
Okay, let me just grab the woodcut. So this was the woodcut that I did for the show at the same time. And woodcuts are really interesting because they're a very slow, to create them, it's a very slow, tedious process that requires a lot of patience. People out there who've done them before know that. And the other reason I did woodcuts, I started doing woodcuts, is, I always like learning something new, but I also thought it was a way for me to start doing charitable things. Like for the Equinox show, we just printed this woodcut on cheap butcher paper and sold them for nothing. Right? I think they were $20 or something. And we donated all the money to an environmental charity, an oceans charity. So, when you're in the art game for a little while, artists out there know this, you end up thinking about your position in the art world a lot. And it was nice to do something like this so that I could maybe not think about myself so much and do something for someone else for a change. So that's sort of what's happened with the woodcut.
And you also mentioned in relation to those woodcuts, which I was able to witness in person at Equinox, that there were some that were slightly over printed, and you'd like those particularly. Can you speak to that for just a moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's where the art comes in, is when you're printing, even though you're working with a static thing that you've carved, and, technically speaking, the outcome should be reasonably predictable. The artful part of woodcuts is when you get to start actually printing. So I have my own press in the studio, and my wife and I did them, Lori. And it was interesting because you could do things like you could print the same image twice, slightly askew. There were all kinds of options available. So those were my favorites in that wall.
And if you don't mind, Kim, I'd like to back up a little bit to the digital version of Last Light.
Sure.
And if you could just dig into a little bit of, when you began to use digital imagery as a support for your painting and integrated it into your painting, and how has it affected you?
Sure. Are we going to go back to that actual image? Sure. Great. Well, yeah, I mean, I spent pretty much all of 2017 and 2018 trying to figure out how to combine digital imagery, or digital painting, I called it, because I would work on my paintings, in Photoshop and get them done to a certain point, have them printed, and then bring them to the studio and then finish them off. And my thinking at the time was just that, it's another tool in the toolbox. It's another, way to make paintings. So I became pretty obsessed with it, mostly in how to print them. That just drove me mad. But I have, If anybody knows Roy at ABC Photo, he's genius. So anyway, he's great. And so, yeah, he really helped me figure a lot of that out. And then the other thing is, because I'm a colorist, you know, I'm always trying to figure out ways to charge my colors as much as possible, which I think might be evident behind me. It's a good way to see your paintings at full saturation before you start working on them.
And the other thing I'm curious in terms of how you move from essentially a digital image that you said allows you to make some decisions around scale. How do you transition from what we have here, which is essentially a very flat graphic image, to the much more impasto and kind of graphic scratchiness to your actual paintings?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's just, every medium sort of has its good qualities and its limitations. So, you know, the digital image can only do so much. And then with a painting, you have, you know, scale, like that painting's 8 by 16 feet or something like that. You have scale, you have the intensity of pigment, you can build the thicknesses. So yeah, the decisions are very different when it comes to making a large painting. I mean, a painting, I don't know that this thing printed at the scale of the painting would be quite as impactful as the painting. So.
And on the topic of scale, Kim, before we leave this wonderful triptych, you had mentioned that part of the determining factor behind the scale of Last Light here behind me was the fact that you had an opportunity at Equinox Gallery to have a very generous space allotted to your show.
Yes. Well, I think Andy, when he gave me that show, he gave me the entire gallery, and I think he'd only mentioned that, he mentioned to me that only Gathy Falk and Gordon Smith, who were both total icons here, and in the whole country. So yeah, I kind of felt like I had to bring my best to that show.
And you know, most definitely did. And we're so happy. This work really anchors the conclusion of our permanent collection as you move from room to room. Perhaps now we can move to the images of some of the other works that were in that Equinox show and that are related to this piece.
Okay.
And here we go.
Okay, great. Yeah, so yeah, and then these were some of the paintings that were also in the show, and it kind of highlights maybe my narrative a little bit more than the other painting can, because that's more of I call it a summary painting, not like summary, like summarize. So for example, when I did my big show at the McMichael Gallery, you know, there was the painting there called French River, and it was like the build-up of a lot of years of painting kind of all put into that painting. And I would say the same happened with Last Light. So there was another painting in, my son was just born, so 2006, called Woods Number 4, which was another one of those massive triptychs. But around the show, there was also this kind of, you know, I just had this kind of moment of clarity that the way that I was engaging with nature was a bit irresponsible. I just couldn't look at nature and what was happening to it, watching the forest burn for another summer where the sun is only red through smoke, etc. I just wanted to start to speak to that a little bit. So this painting is called The Last Plein Air Painter Paints the Last Lie. And I think it's, all jokes aside, pretty obvious what's going on. Next slide. Yeah, so in the narrative, and it'll make more sense later in the talk here why I keep talking about this narrative, but in the narrative that I constructed, the painter goes into the woods and basically gets consumed by the woods. So this painting is called He Doesn't Know, and basically he doesn't know that he's died. So the skull kind of peering over the shoulder speaks to that. And this isn't necessarily an advertisement for Nike, not for Nike, sorry. It's definitely not an advertisement for Nike. For Adidas, idiot. But this is my favorite painting jacket, which I've worn for like 20 years. And then in the You Are Here show that I did with McMichael, the cover painting for the book, and I think the first painting you saw in the show, there was this little tongue-in-cheek thing I did where it's this painter painting in the woods, you know, like the Group of Seven or whatever. But his shoe is sort of turned to the side and he's got these Adidas shoes. And that was kind of my way of making sure that people know that I'm not this kind of rough and tumble plein air painter that goes into the woods. I'm a, you know, as influenced as I am by the landscape, my approach is much different than that. So that was kind of why I added the shoes as well. Next slide. This painting is called How Do We Manage Not to Touch Anything? And I wanted to do a painting. This was the most difficult painting for me to do in the show. I wanted to do a painting where there was a figure in the painting, but the figure wasn't there really. But it was a figure that was totally static, but not by their own will. So I had this idea of vines growing out of the skull of this figure, like the Green Man myth or whatever, and surrounding the figure and attaching itself to all the trees around it to kind of hold the body still. And in my own way, I think this is a painting about, you know, depression and anxiety. And then just to give a sense of how the painting is constructed, you know, I think it's fairly obvious where the thick parts are. What I would do is, once I built the figure or knew where the figure was going to be, I just started squeezing green paint in vines over and over and over. And the way that I do that is I'm back. I actually I'll mix huge amounts of green paint and I'll put them in these bakery icing bags. And then that allows me to squeeze out massive amounts of this paint. And I don't really mix it with anything. I don't really put gels or anything into it because I don't like the way it dries the paint. I like the paint to sort of dry naturally. So that's how that figure was constructed.
Excellent. Okay.
And then this is a more recent painting called Carry On. And this is an homage to one of my favorite artists and my favorite painting by the artist Philip Guston. And it's actually not even an oil painting, it's a drawing he did. And it's this bandaged eyeball with nails out of it and hair out of it. And it's just grimly moving up the hill, which often feels like a perfect allegory for painting. I enjoy what I do, you know, but you know, it's a tough slog sometimes.
And next, we'll go to the next slide.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay. And Kim, in these works, particularly the last few, your background seemed somewhat flatter, if you will, than the piece behind me. Can you speak to, you know, how you determine the nature of your backgrounds off against the foreground figure?
Yeah, I mean, my first goal with a painting, no matter what the subject is now, especially, is I like to build up a color relationship behind the subject. You know, it's hard because, like, when you're talking about paintings, there's this want to kind of describe the painting to the point where it's not even interesting anymore. So, you know, in my work especially, it's a sum of its parts, and all of those things are kind of working together to create this, hopefully this mood or this tone or this, you know, because like sometimes it's hard to describe, like why is this vine figure walking in this inky forest? Why is there fire on the side, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, every kind of component of the painting, especially now the flatter, more vibrant backgrounds, where it's just oil. What I do is, I don't hide my methods. People are welcome to take them, I don't care. So what I do is I actually have my canvases stretched so that it's pre-primed canvas, but the priming is on the inside. So that way you almost get like a watercolor-like surface. And then I'll either drain oil or acrylic into that and basically build a color that just kind of throws the mood into the painting. And then I start to develop the subject that way. Did that answer your question at all? Was that an answer? Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely answered my question, Kim. So now we're going to switch to the question and answer section of the broadcast. And we were fortunate tonight that we received upwards of 15 or 20 pre-submitted questions. And the first one is from Connor in Kelowna, British Columbia. And he asks, in what ways do you think moving to the West Coast has affected your painting?
Great, thanks, Connor. Well, I think that my relationship to landscape has changed quite a bit, because the landscape, I've said this before several times, but the landscape out here I find actually immensely terrifying, because it's not, the landscape that I was used to dealing with in Ontario or even Alberta was definitely about like foreground, mid-ground would be the forest or whatever. But here it's just all forest. And if you travel 3 feet in, you can just disappear into it. So beyond the fact that, you know, I think the paintings became more claustrophobic, I also think that they became more intensely psychological out here.
Okay.
I think that.
And I'm sure that moving from Toronto to Vancouver, that's been a question that you've received
I've heard
many
it, yeah.
times. Okay, and then Doria from here in Whistler, British Columbia asks, do you do many small sketches in planning for your works, or do you develop them directly on the canvas?
I mostly draw now to organize compositions. I used to do a lot more studies. For example, the ones that were done for Last Light. And then the other thing I do more now is, especially with this kind of new narrative approach, is I write more. So weirdly, the paintings have been coming more from a place of fiction. That's kind of the way that I work it out. That and just basic black and white ink drawings.
And when you say that you write, Kim, is it kind of in the form of a short story or just quick prose, or?
Quick prose, quick notes. Yeah, like that.
Oh,
and then, and then there's always, and then, there's sort of, you can plan a painting as much as you want, right? But when you're dealing with drains and thicknesses and so on and so forth, there is a part of you that isn't in control. And I think a smart painter recognizes, the best part of both of those. So there is like a real attempt to do something, like I'm going in with a specific idea, but hopefully in my old age, I've become smart enough to recognize when something interesting is happening just because it's paint, and something different is happening when you're trying to move it around. Chance is just as big a collaborator as my intention.
Excellent. I'd like to hear that about chance.
Yeah.
We work on a similar premise here at the Audain. And our next question comes from Sierra in Barrie, Ontario. And she asks, when considering earlier works, can you recognize themes of environmental degradation before you're aware of its significance?
Well, landscape was always like a stage set for me. So my earliest works that were considered successful were a lot of the sort of Alberta scenes, the bush parties, the fights in the woods, and so on. So there was always this kind of engagement with nature, but not in a reverent way. And then I got sick of painting teenagers in the forest. So after that, my approach to the forest became like, how do we make marks in the forest? How do we mark our place in the woods or whatever? And generally speaking, with those paintings, it was more things like graffiti and destruction like that, broken beer bottles, etc. So that has always been in the work. And I would say, how fragile the environment has become has really amplified in the last, 5 or 6 years, it's always been there, and it's always been, but the last 5 or 6 years have been quite terrifying. Like, that's the only way to put it, with everything that's happening. And also the fact that my kids are getting older and starting to be able to engage with the world and ask questions like, why hasn't it rained in 85 days? Things like that. I don't mean to make light of that, but you know, that's the kind of headspace I'm in right now. So the environment was always there. How we interact with the environment was always there, but maybe things have been amplified. The anxiety has been amplified quite a bit in the last 3-4 years in my work.
And do you see, just to dovetail with that, Kim, do you see any opportunities, or have you thought about other types of environmental degradation outside, let's say, the predominant forest imagery in your work?
Well, the woods are my wheelhouse. You know, that's where kind of everything happens with my work. Or, you know, when I'm working with more suburban themes, you know, the intersection of you know, nature and culture. So I'd say that's where I'm the most engaged. So I guess no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nope, that's good. That's valid. So in terms of the last question, and this is kind of obviously related to urban anxiety from the 19th century, what other artists beside Munch have inspired you?
Yeah, I'm a pretty voracious looker at paintings. You know, like, there's always somebody influencing me. I'd say the biggest ones would be Munch for sure. Jeff Wall, when I was a student at Emily Carr, and basically all we learned about was the photoconceptualist, which I'm not dissing in any way. The way that Jeff Wall constructed his images had a profound influence on my work. You know, I mean, Emily Carr and Trude, who I just spoke about. It kind of goes on and on. Peter Doig, who is wonderful. I think the best painting that I've seen in the last 5 years is Noah Davis from the US. I can't wait to see some of those paintings in person. That's the nice thing about painting, and especially these days, right? There's so many people you can see now. We have such access.
I'm kind of curious because, as you know, the Audain Art Museum has one of the premier Emily Carr collections anywhere in the world. And maybe comment a little more on Emily Carr and her influence on your work.
Well, I'm going to be really blunt and say when I was a student, I actually wasn't a fan of Emily Carr. And I think it was because I hadn't actually ventured into the forest, this forest, deeply. And now, in the last 10 years, I've realized that she's one of the greatest painters of all time. Not just Canadian painters, but, you know, painters of all time, which is fabulous. I love her early work. I love how she was almost this sort of French impressionist. And then once she made the Canadian landscape, I don't want to say her own, because nobody can own the landscape, but once she was comfortable in depicting what was around her, I mean, she was unstoppable. She's amazing.
I would tend to agree with that. In fact, the exhibition that we did here earlier, or in the fall of last year, Fresh Seeing, examined exactly what you mentioned, how she took that lesson from France and transposed it here to North America. And that exhibition is actually, we're looking for a third venue that'll be announced soon.
Oh, fabulous.
So, the last question is actually going to come directly from me, Kim, and I know that you're working on one project that is very new for you, and we do have some images, so perhaps you could just delve into your current production that is not painting.
Sure. Yeah, so this whole narrative thing has made me actually want to create a narrative, and so I've been working on this graphic novel art book for the last, well, I've been writing the book for about 2 years, and I've been drawing it now for about 6 or 7 months, and I'm on page like 85 or 86. And I'm not going to show all the cells because it'll take forever, but it's basically a wordless art book, graphic novel thing. And the reason I'm hesitant to say graphic novel is because I don't want to just step in. It's like when I curated a show, right? But I'm not like a curator. I don't want to just step in and declare it. I want to earn it. So anyway, the book project though is basically the story that I've been talking about this painter who goes into the woods to be a plein air painter with this kind of romantic notion. And he goes in and he fails miserably and he gets lost, and his significant other realizes that he's been missing, so she goes to find him. And inside of that forest, crazy things happen. But there's a discussion about the environment, apathy, anxiety, relationships, love, depression. So I'm hoping that it all comes in there. So I'm just going to show just a handful of cells from the beginning, and then I'll show some that I'm currently working on and leave it at that. So this is the cell where he is heading into the forest. We can go to the next one. Right, so when you're working with wordless, it's a really interesting thing because each picture, each drawing has to function as its own work of art, but also carry the narrative along. So it's, yeah, this is actually the hardest thing I've ever done is this book. Next cell. So he's going in, he's sort of leaving suburbia, he's going deeper into the woods. Next cell. Now, I've missed maybe 20 pages here, but he realizes that he's just not doing it. So he just writes, fuck this shit on the canvas, breaks his brush, throws it down, leaves his phone, and just heads in. Next cell. Or next, yeah. So this is just this is where the figure, the female figure of the story comes in. So this is her going to the space. Next cell. Right, so the repetition of her going into the same space. Next cell. And then we move to if we can go to the next one. I think this is a little bit later in the book. In the forest, they've both kind of transformed into these weird monsters. She is a ghost that vibrates so hard that you can't see her form anymore. And he's this vine guy that I've used in paintings and so on. And they both have these kind of animals that help them through the forest. He has an owl that looks out for him, and she has these 5 rabbits. So this is where they finally find each other and meet. Next cell. And they're about to embrace. Next cell. But they can't because she's basically dead. It's not a feel-good book. I'm not gonna lie. So next page. So this is them going through each other. This is him reaching his hand through her and realizing that he can't touch her, and they decide to move on together. And then I think there's one more, which is the next one. Yeah, so now they're sort of heading into this forest together with their animals, kind of forging ahead of them. So yeah, I just wanted to, nobody's seen these yet. This is like actually really difficult for me to show these, but you know, these are just a few little sections of this bigger narrative that I'm working out. And then if we go to the next one, these are just some new paintings that are literally up on my walls right now.
Next.
Yeah, so this actually, you might recognize it. This is from one of the cells before. So the book is helping me figure out some of the paintings that I want to do. This is just getting started. It's not going to be done until the wires are completely full of crows. And the tops of the trees obviously need to be finessed a lot. And then the next one is just like the view to the wall behind me. Just a few things I'm working on right now.
Okay. Well, that's where we're going to wind up, Kim. And I just want to thank you for giving us such a nice perspective on this major piece in our collection, as well as the fact that you've been quite revealing with your new graphic novel work. And I'm sure everyone is looking forward to that issue. So thank you so much. And I also have a number of thank yous. I want to thank the team here at the Audain Art Museum that have been working so diligently towards our reopening that, as I said, is coming on Friday, June 26th. I would also like to thank our founder, Michael Audain, and Yoshika Karasawa. They've been a wonderful visionaries, and in addition to creating a very family atmosphere around the museum with not only the staff, but our trustees who make such a wonderful contribution, in addition to our members that we are really looking forward to welcoming back, our volunteers, our docents who are all very much getting excited to turn the museum on again and get out of this flashlight. I'd be remiss if I didn't give a big thank you to our Tuesday night talk crew, our director-producer, Justine Nickel, our quality control coordinator, who touches up my hair every so often, Erica Chan. And in addition to opening on Friday the 26th, Saturday the 27th, and Sunday the 28th, we'll also have a special Canada Day opening, obviously on July 1st, which falls on a Wednesday this year. A couple shout outs, or just one, to my father in Cornwall, Ontario. I always miss Father's Day, or I'm usually a day late, so I'm going to come in a few days early, and I'm sure my sister Susie in Canada will underline that for me. So thanks, Dad. I also want to give a big thank you to the Equinox Gallery, who's been very helpful in us setting up this talk. And a little shout out to Andre, who is Kim's faux Frenchie, who joins him in his studio, a picture of which you may have seen in the registration form. And I
First time he's ever
never want to, he's never had a show. And I never want to be remiss in thanking you, our viewers, that have made this program such a wonderful success. We have 2 more episodes coming up in the following two Tuesdays, and we're already planning for season 2, which will run in January and February of 2021. And before I leave, I want to say just again, Kim, you've offered us just a wonderful and exciting and insightful look at this major piece in the collection. So thank you so much, Kim. And I'll give you a wave. Remember, that was our signal, and we'll go back to you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great evening, Kim. Thank you to all our viewers. TNT is out for another night. See you all next week.